So anyway, Bill and I, when we were starting working on this back in '95, the question that we wanted to ask ourselves is, what might society do to try to reduce the rate at which these killings occur? And we've seen this question dealt with in many countries in different ways. Just over the last decade, you've seen cases in Tasmania and Australia where there was a mass public killing that was there in Dunblane, Scotland. And in the United Kingdom and Australia, the response was either to completely, essentially ban handguns or virtually completely ban guns. But that hasn't been the response every place. We were talking about Israel earlier. Israel's response to these types of killings in the early 1970s was to greatly liberalize concealed handgun laws at that time. One thing that's interesting, if you ever go and do a news search on articles during and around that period of time, what you'll find is that in the period prior to that liberalization, every month, sometimes every week, there would be some type of attempt to bring machine guns into a mall, into a synagogue, into a restaurant, into a nursery school or a regular school, and just horrific killings that were occurring. And one thing that happened when these rules changed is that the attacks didn't the form that they took changed fairly dramatically in Israel. Before the concealed handgun permits were widely used, you had machine gun attacks. Afterwards, the attacks are virtually all bombings. Recently, there's been a slight move back to some shootings, but they're still fairly rare as a percentage of all attacks. You can kind of explain that and understand that type of substitution as a result of this law. If you go and have machine guns and the people you're trying to shoot have guns, you're giving them a chance to respond. One of the stories that I found amusing was shortly after the liberalization of concealed handgun laws, and I think it was '73, there was a story I came across of one of the attacks in Israel where 4 armed terrorists had gone into a mall, and they had pulled out the machine guns and started firing. And the people in the mall there pulled out the pistols and started firing at the attackers there. And one of the terrorists, the only one who survived, as he was being taken to the hospital, was quoted as complaining to the medical attendants there. He was quite upset, apparently, that no one had warned him that the old ladies would have pistols and be able to go and fire back at them. So, but it does give you some thoughts there. I mean, it says that there are lots of ways that these types of attacks can occur, even if it's not with guns. There's something, as an economist, we kind of refer to as what we call revealed preference, that obviously prior to the concealed handgun laws, they had a choice between using machine guns and bombs. They apparently chose to use machine guns even though they had a choice, so they must have believed it was more effective or something in some way. Now there's empirical questions about how much less effective bombs are than machine guns, but those are things one can try to go and measure. In the United States also, there's some of the push for concealed handgun laws has been due to similar concerns about multiple victim public shootings. The woman that I mentioned before lost her parents at the restaurant in Texas has probably been responsible for at least a couple of the laws getting passed in different states. Because what had happened was, one thing that I left out is the woman, Susanna Grasser-Hupp, she had apparently been illegally carrying a handgun with her up until a week before the shooting at the Luby's cafeteria. She worked late at night, and she was concerned for her safety. She's a nurse, and a prosecutor friend of hers basically told her to carry a handgun because of concerns about her safety. But she had decided about a week before the incident that it was simply wrong for her to be breaking the law, and that she wasn't going to do that anymore. And so she had stopped carrying it with her. In fact, when she arrived at the Luby's cafeteria restaurant with her parents, earlier that morning, she had gone target practice shooting and still had the pistol in her purse, and had started to walk into the restaurant and realized that she had the gun with her, and had gone back to her car and locked the gun in her car, and then gone back and joined her parents in the restaurant there. And when the attack started, she could see her car through the broken plate glass windows of the restaurant there, about 30-some yards away, but other people who had tried to go out and escape through the front of the restaurant, she was seeing being killed as they were trying to flee there, and so she basically figured the best policy was to try to play dead there. There have been other cases. One story I can kind of bring up to kind of give you an idea also of news bias. One person was asking me at lunch about news cases, and that is, you may remember a couple months ago, or actually January now, the Appalachian Law School shooting in Virginia, in which 3 people were killed, got a lot of attention. Well over 200 news stories in the 1 week after that incident. But one thing that was interesting, if you go through, and I don't know if there are lawyers here, but if you go through and do a Nexus search or Lexis search on, or Westlaw, whatever, on the news stories, you'll find that of those 200 and some cases, only 4 of the news articles will mention in any way that the students who stopped the attack had guns with them. And only 2 of those 4 stories will actually mention that they actually used the guns to go and stop the attack. I talked to reporters from the Washington Post who had written up one of the stories where they simply mentioned that the students had tackled the person. I had asked Maria Glad, who was one of the reporters who had written there, whether she knew about the fact that the students had had guns, and she said yes. But she thought that she didn't have a lot of space in the story, and she just didn't think that it was particularly important to try to go through it. My guess is also that few of you might know, I don't know, maybe in this group they might, but that in 4 of the 13 public school shootings that have occurred since October of 97 have been stopped by citizens with guns well before the police were able to arrive. If you look at the first of the public school shootings in Pearl, Mississippi, in early October 1997, in which 2 students were killed, there was an assistant principal there at the school, former Marine, had a permit to carry a concealed handgun. Apparently, up until the end of 95, when the Safe School Zone Act was passed, essentially banning guns within 1,000 feet of a school, he would apparently keep the gun with him when he was on school property. After that law was passed, he would lock his gun in his car, and I don't know, maybe this tells us too much about him, but he measured the distance from the edge of the school property to find out how far off the school property he had to park his car in order to obey the 1,000-foot rule that was there. But he would, when he would arrive at school in the morning, would lock the gun in his car and then park at this distance away from school. Anyway, when the attack started, he ran to his car, got his pistol, came back, and point blank range held the attacker there for over 5.5 minutes before the police arrived. If you go and look at the news stories, in the 1 month after that event, you'll find about 687 separate news stories on that shooting. Of those 687 stories, 19 will mention the assistant principal in any way. 13 of the 19 stories will mention that he had something to do with stopping the attack. And only 10 of the news stories will mention that he used a gun to stop the attack. None of those were on the national evening news. There was one mention on ABC News at 4 a.m. in the morning, the day after the attack. It was about a sentence and a half that they had on it. The other ones were basically in small local media around the country. Now, I can go through other cases that are there, but basically, we don't have an overhead here, so I'll just basically summarize the findings that Bill and I have, and that is, we find that when a state, we looked at data The main data that we looked at was from 1977 through 1997 for all the states in the United States. Multiple victim public shooting was defined in the simplest ways when 2 or more people were killed or injured in a public place. Any type of public place, basically outside of residence. And we excluded gang fights or gang killings. Because we wanted to basically try to get at these types of attacks where the main purpose of it seemed to try to be to create as much carnage, or the types of things that come to mind with a lot of these shootings. What we found is that when a state adopts a non-discretionary concealed handgun law, I should basically define it. You basically have 2 different types of laws. Non-discretionary ones are you have some objective criteria. You have the person who's applying for a permit at a certain age, that has a criminal background check. About half the states require some type of training. You pay your fee. But once you've met those criteria and you apply for a permit, it's automatically granted. So, for example, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, your neighbors, they basically have these types of laws. The other type of law, so about 33 states in that category, and then you have about 11 states which are discretionary, and that includes Massachusetts, where you can, in theory, get a permit, but you have to go and demonstrate need to some type of local public official. And so you have many fewer permits that are issued. And basically what we find is that the average number of deaths from multiple victim public shootings falls by about 75%, and the injury rate falls by about 81% after these laws are adopted.